animation segment's keyframe poses. These are useful to communicate the start and ending of each action sequence and what is happening. In this lesson, we're going to be doing what's called breaking down the animation, which is where between these keyframe poses, we create new keyframes to primarily communicate the motion that's happening. The breakdown frames in animation are some of the most fun to work with because we can start to really stretch and warp the characters that we're working with to communicate things like squash and stretch, and to use animation smears to accentuate speed and motion. And we can also use the positioning of our breakdown frames to start planning the speed at which things will play out. So before we begin, I'm going to create a blank keyframe between my first keyframe and my second keyframe when the monkey hits the ground. On this blank keyframe, I'm going to activate my onion skin, and you can see the frame before and after my blank keyframe. Our first frame is in the height of the monkey's apex, and our second keyframe is in the collision. We have an arc of motion extending between these two keyframes. So we could, in theory, put our breakdown keyframe directly in the middle there, and that would mean that our in-between frames would break up the animation, and then we would essentially have something like 6 frames of animation communicating this first part of the fall. But something to be aware of is the fact that the distance between these frames affects the motion that we have, and then separate to that, the distance between the physical placement of our character will also affect the way that speed plays through. These are two separate things, but we need to realize how they're working together. So the first being the position of the frames, I'm going to demonstrate on a new layer with a ball, and I'm going to keep my little guide here and hide my monkey. And I just want to use this as an example, an opportunity before we go into the breakdown details to show you what I'm going through in my head when I place my breakdown frames. So I've got my apex arc here that I'm going to follow. I'm going to wireframe and lock it, and I'm going to create a little circle, a ball, and I'm just going to put this here at that first keyframe, and I'm going to make a duplicate keyframe on frame 11 and place it at the collision point. This is, in a much simpler, clearer way, duplicating what the monkey's motion is. Now we're going to essentially do a preliminary planned guide for how this ball might be placed, but I'm going to do a few examples for you. So the first example is maybe stretching the ball out a bit to show you some of that motion as the ball's going down, but placing it directly in the middle. And then later on, we're going to get to in-betweens, which is where you essentially fill the frames in directly in between these keyframes. And the result then, if evenly spaced apart, is something that looks good, but is in its motion a bit static. It doesn't really communicate much extremity. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everything's quite smooth. So I'm going to create a new layer and create a new example on this layer, pasting the first and last keyframe of my example segment here and hiding the initial example. And I'm going to add my breakdown frame in the middle, but I'm actually going to drag it forward 2 frames. You'll notice now that even though I placed the ball in the middle of the motion, with a greater distance between the first keyframe and the breakdown frame than the breakdown frame and the last collision frame, the motion is going to be more spread apart at the start and faster at the end. The result of this, when I then add some in-between frames, is that the ball appears to accelerate before it collides. This can be accentuated even more by having the initial frames even closer together and then the last few frames with the ball spread quite apart. We can also really stretch this ball just before it collides with the ground to show that the acceleration is really maximizing here and that there's going to be a lot of impact when it hits. The result is much more dynamic than our initial example. So I'm going to show you with a loop segment on so you can see it speeding up and accentuating some motion. In my previous example, things are a little flatter. Now it's hard to see in context because it's a very short segment of motion, but when we have the monkey doing the same thing, it'll be much more visually appealing to stretch the motion around in a way that works really well with what we're trying to accentuate. So I'm going to turn these layers into guides so that you can check them out later, and I'm going to hide them so we don't need to really come back to that. So now I'm going to go back to my monkey sketch and we're going to play around with the breakdown of the monkey. So to begin with, we create that blank keyframe between the first and second keyframes, and I'm going to draw the shape of the head, the circle, the same size as the monkey's initial keyframe. Again, sketchy is fine because we're sort of roughing in our frames here, and I'm going to copy the resulting circle so that I can paste it later on every time I need a circle the same dimensions as the monkey's head. And then I'm going to drag this head down and I'm going to draw the monkey in his sort of height of acceleration, and it's going to be more accentuated. So I'm actually going to stretch this head out in the direction that he's falling so we can see that that acceleration is picking up. You'll notice that I'm drawing this frame immediately between the first and second keyframes. That's because I prefer to create it immediately next to both and then drag it out into the position that I want it to be in, and I can play through and tweak that position until I'm happy with how the motion is looking. So I first do the drawing immediately next to everything, and then I spread things out and then I play with how it's spread out. So getting back to the breakdown, I'm going to be drawing the monkey's eyes wide open this time. I'm going to make sure I have the proportions in the right place. And you can see that the eyes are stretched vertically. This is to help accentuate that stretching motion, and everything on the monkey's head and then later the monkey's body is going to accentuate this motion. Before I get through to the details of the head, I'm going to continue with the body sketch. So I'm going to draw my little backwards bean here. Just reposition the monkey slightly, and I'm going to have his legs sort of trailing back a bit to show that they have a secondary motion to the body itself. I'm going to have the hands sort of dragging in front of him like this. So we can see he's got this limp sort of look as he's falling backwards, but we're also getting a bit of a stretched aesthetic. I'm then going to stretch the tail around so it is following and accentuating that arc of motion, and the entire body is straightening out quite a lot, and this is really going to help accentuate that motion as he follows the arc downwards. I'm adding in the ears now, and then drawing in the hairline for the monkey's face, and then adding in the mouth. As we mentioned previously in our keyframe tutorial, extremity in motion is helped by using certain appendages and stretching them out with that motion. So for example, here the hair can be stretched in front of the face to accentuate the motion that's happening here. So this is my first breakdown pose. You can see that while still fairly proportioned normally, it's stretched somewhat. And the entire body is accentuating the motion itself. And this is where breakdown poses can be really fun, because you can use them as opportunities to really make the motion pop out and find creative ways to do that. Now that I've drawn my breakdown pose, I'm going to drag the frame out towards the middle, and I'll play with the placement between the first and second keyframe later on, while I then move on to the next second and third keyframes and create the breakdown between these two. But before we jump straight into creating the next breakdown, I want to use this next display of animation from our second keyframe to our third and fourth. So we have this full arc of motion from our hitting the ground to our apex and then hitting the ground again, to talk about two principles of animation that are really helpful to make something like this come to life. So I'm going to use my onion skin and show all of these three keyframes here, and I'm going to draw in the arc of motion. We have an impact at both of these locations, and then we have an arc of motion with an apex in the middle, and then finally coming down to hitting the ground. So we previously talked about the frame placement between these key frames, from hitting the ground to reaching the apex and vice versa. Now I want to talk about something called easing in and easing out. And we did sort of allude to that or cover that previously, but this situation is a perfect example to demonstrate what I really mean when we're talking about the easing in and easing out in the motion of an arc. So as previously mentioned, the most boring and static way to go about animating something like this would be to create frames evenly spread throughout. And we've already demonstrated that spacing them apart differently and stretching out some of those middle frames can be a really useful way to accentuate the motion. But in an arc like this, there's very clearly a way we should go about it. And that is that the motion is accelerated to begin with and then slows down until we reach the apex, which is the slowest point out of the entire motion, until we then begin to come back down, and then the motion is once again accelerated until we get the second collision. The reason this is important to keep in mind is because the area in here and the area in here are both the places most important to accentuate in our visuals. So in the first few frames immediately after the collision and immediately before the next collision, we can use things like squash and stretch and animation smears to really make that motion pop out. So I'm going to demonstrate this now in the next section of animation between the second and third keyframes. I'm going to create a blank keyframe between those keyframes and create the breakdown. But the breakdown is going to look very weird because we're going to do something called create a smear. As you can see, the positions between these two poses is extremely different. We have on the left a monkey upside down and all squashed up with his legs held high, with his butt sort of facing to the left of the screen. And then next we have a monkey facing forwards with his butt to the right of the screen and all stretched out with his limbs flailing behind. So because these keyframe poses are so different, we can use an animation smear to show a rapid transition between point A and point B with an entertaining and stylistic approach. To do so, I'm going to start off by sketching in the head, and this isn't going to follow our perfect circle head, so I'm not going to paste the circle that I had before. I am, however, going to position the head in a place halfway between these poses, which I think would be somewhere like this. And the next thing I'm going to do is outline where the butt would be halfway between these 2 points. So if this is the arc of motion for the butt to flail around, the halfway point would be somewhere here. But rather than just draw the body of the monkey, I'm going to stretch the body of the monkey all the way along half of this arc at the center point of the arc. And you can see that we're getting this really weird looking stretch. I'm also going to add an animation smear for the tail, following the same idea that we have this very long arc between these two poses and stretching out all the way between these two poses. So because the tail is straight, we can essentially have one really, really long tail like this. And that's going to look silly in one frame, but when you rapidly flick from that initial keyframe to the arc of the motions keyframe, you can see that it's accentuating that motion. Now I do believe that it's a little bit too curved, and because the motion is so rapid, the tail would actually be quite straight and stretched. So I'm really going to stretch that out, and next I'm going to add some limbs. Once again, figuring out the start and end points, we have a hand here and a hand here in the first section, and then we have a hand here and here in our next section. So halfway between, we would have our front hand sort of forward like this, but I'm going to stretch the fingers out quite far, and I'm going to do the same with this hand. I'm going to have the arm coming out, and I'm going to have the fingers really stretching out. Now this looks quite odd. It doesn't look anything like a monkey at the moment. I'm going to alter the body somewhat. And we're really not maintaining our proportions at all, which is something we were initially very careful of. Don't worry about that, because this is where we're using the distortion to make the most out of this motion segment. I'm then going to sketch in the feet. As you can see, they're mostly hidden by the body and the arms, which are rapidly flailing in front of the feet and the back of the body. And now I can test this animation smear by turning off my onion skin, dragging that frame toward the middle, and then playing through these frames and seeing how it looks. And I feel like that actually looks pretty alright. Now I can add some details of the monkey's face to this animation smear frame in the breakdown, and I'm going to really accentuate the eyes and make them huge. This means that for a very small glimpse of the animation, the viewers are going to see a very shocked, wide face during the most extreme, stretchy part of the animation. I can pull out the hair to stretch out really far as well to help that motion be accentuated. And then I can sketch in the rest of the face. Now here's a problem. There are a couple of ways I could have done this, and upon further flicking through it, I feel like I'm not capturing it the way I want to. So the solution to this is delete it, and that's okay. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm looking at this and I feel like the motion needs to be accentuated in a different way, and I feel like the head should be the way to do it. Particularly because he hits his head, which gets squashed the most, and then his head has the most expression in the next area. I also feel like with the motion itself, the head has quite a long way to travel and the body could mostly be hidden up behind the head for that. And I feel like I placed too much emphasis on the body. So I'm going to fix that, try from scratch, see what I think, and hopefully it's better. If it's not, I'm going to have to start again. And that's just the nature of animation. But the good thing about this is that I'm doing it pretty rough. I'm sketching it through, and I haven't done any clean line work or meticulous coloring, and fixing mistakes or removing and adding sections is much simpler, and we can really test out the whole animation and refine it before we get to the actual refinement phase. So now I'm going to try this next idea. And I'm going to do the same thing in terms of using animation smears to accentuate what's happening here in the motion. I just feel like I sort of did it in a way that wasn't very complimentary. So now I'm going to do it with a different part of the body, which is the head. And you can see that I've turned the head into this warped tube. And I'm going to stretch it out even more. And I'm going to add these big circles for where the eyes are going to be. So I feel like a position like that might work well. And I have a mouth sort of as wide as the entirety of that motion, and eyes that are stretched at the pupils in the middle. And we have long eyebrows and hair that's flicking in front of the face in a really long stretched motion. Then I can sketch out the outline of the hair and add in the ears. So this is obviously a bit too big. I'm going to drag it in. We have our bounce and then a very stretched out head before we get to the apex of the motion. This time I'm going to have the butt still following that arc, but as you can see, it's mostly hidden by the head. So this time the limbs will still stretch out between these two keyframes that I'm drawing the breakdown between, but they're going to be a little bit more hidden behind the head, and that's okay because the head is where we want to put the most emphasis on our motion. Now I'm going to add in the tail again, and I'm going to keep up that arc of motion that I had before, but this time, once again, the head is the star of the show here. Now I want to see how this motion looks, and I'm going to test it in the same way that I tested my other animation smear, and I'm much happier with how that looks because the head is the thing that looks rubbery as it hits the ground and he bounces off the ground. Our next breakdown frame is between the apex and the next time he hits the ground, so I'm going to create a blank keyframe there and show the frame before and after with my onion skin tool, and I'm going to now paste the circle that I initially sketched and put it sort of between these, but I'm going to have it closer towards the first frame because what I'm going to do to stretch out this frame, aside from stretching the head very slightly in the direction of the motion, is I'm going to have the body falling butt first with the legs flailing up and the hands sort of following up, and a long neck between them. So the most of the stretching is going to be happening here in the body. So his feet are going to be straight and stretched out, both of them. And his arms are going to sort of widen out and be sort of to his side, but with his elbows up. I feel like the head is a little too strongly skewed to the left, so I'm going to stretch that up a bit more. And now I'm going to sketch in the features of the face. Wide eyes, still a feature here. I don't want to have too many smears on the face because then it might look too constantly distorted through the motion. So we don't want to overdo it, but we do still want to keep that accentuation. Small pupils to match our first frame. A little more towards the viewer so that they're more noticeable. And then once again, we can accentuate our motion by moving this little tuft of hair at the top of his head, which is fast becoming one of the most useful aspects of this character's design, along with the tail, as far as pushing the boundaries of accentuating our motion. Speaking of which, this is another opportunity for the tail to show its magic by stretching all the way back behind here through the motion. And you can see that we have this very hard arrow of the body facing down directly into where his butt is going to be hitting. I do want to rotate him slightly just so that it looks like his butt is heading exactly to where his butt will collide. So I just want to make sure it's facing the right area. And now I'm going to test the motion by pulling the keyframe into the middle, turning off my onion skin and playing this through. And as you can see, it's already starting to really come together, and even the expression between these two frames really complement each other through the fall until eventually we get the second hit. One thing I do want to do though is have the head thrown up a bit more. I feel like he's facing too far down here, so I'm actually going to remove the whole face, and I'll even remove the hairpiece and put it up a bit more, and I'm going to face the entire monkey's head upwards like this and redraw the eyes in. I just want to make sure that this looks alright, so I'll check it first, but I really think this is going to be a better way to go about it. Once again, adding in the monkey's open mouth. I'm going to turn the onion skin back on just so I can see between these two frames. And I'm going to draw his lower eyelids lifted up to cover half of his eye. I think that accentuates the expression in a way that works well. I also think I'm using the word accentuates a bit too much, but let's pretend that I'm not, and that it's not annoying. I'm almost happy with it. I'm going to rotate the head back a little bit more just so it shows as if it's thrown back a bit further, and then I'm going to reposition the entire thing slightly and then try playing through it with the breakdown frame pulled into the middle, and that is something I'm much happier with. I do want this frame to be a bit closer to the ground. Playing through once again, and now is the time to sort of make the major tweaks we want to make, but overall I'm quite happy with how the breakdowns have so far accentuated one of the more major parts of the larger keyframe animation section. So next we have another arc, but this one's a much smaller one, and if I show my onion skin through the arc, you can see the beginning, middle and end of this arc of motion, and it's a much more narrow arc. So we don't need to over accentuate as much in this section, but we still want to make the most of the motion as possible. And I do want to add a bit of an animation smear between this first and second head position in this arc. Simply because though we could go directly between these two keyframes and it would look fine, I want to accentuate the motion of the arc. So I actually want the head to be higher than we might do if we were drawing directly between the frames, and I'm going to add a smear, but this time instead of the head being smeared lengthways, it's going to be smeared heightways. So this way his scrunchy eyes are going to be pulled out, his eyebrows are going to be there, and his nose I'm going to add 2 of, just to accentuate that smear again, and I'm going to have a very tall mouth. Now you'll notice I'm adding 2 lines for the teeth. Once again, this is to add to the smear. So though our monkey hasn't got 2 noses and doesn't have 2 lines for teeth, this is to help show that there's a bit of a motion blur without using any motion blurs. It's just simply through the illustration itself. Then of course there's another opportunity to use our front hairpiece as much as we want and really stretch that out. And for the most part, I'm happy with that as a smear for the head. I'm just going to tweak it a little bit though and add some rotation, and I feel like that is something I'm pretty happy with. Next, I'm going to really stretch the arms out and keep them in the position they were initially in on the ground to show that they're stretching before they flick back into the elbows out position that he ends up in. And we have the butt on the next frame up here and the butt on the first frame, so it stands to reason then that his butt is here. But this time we're going to sort of arch the back backwards to show that he's sort of being thrown on this angle. Going to add in his legs, make sure his feet are positioned once again between point A and point B of this motion. And I'm going to add in the tail. Now I had noticed that I didn't add a tail in the arc of the motion when I drew the keyframe. That's okay, because now is my chance to add it. And I'm pretty happy with that as the breakdown. Once again, it's all really sketchy. We're just making sure to get the core aspects of the motion in. I'm going to pull that out into the middle of the keyframes and play this section here. I'm happy with that. And now I'm going to do the final breakdown before he falls and hits the ground. And this one is going to be a lot more straightforward. In fact, we can pretty much use our pre-made head and just draw this as an in-between frame, which is essentially where we're following the lines that we've already got here and drawing the lines to fill in between them. One thing I will do is pull up this back leg a bit more, just so that there's a bit of some extremity in the motion, and it does bend back a little more, so I'm going to bend the entire leg up like this. There is one last area I want to add a smear to in this section of motion, which is in this hand here. And it's not going to be a terribly extreme smear, but it's going to be enough to show that there's a very quick movement from here to here. So I'm going to draw fingers that are really stretched out and long, positioned until they land in that place. You can see that that's going to help that hand look like it's very quickly flopping towards the ground. Finally, we have the features of the head and the back hand, and I'm going to do the same thing with the back hand and show a smear behind there. And I'm going to then draw in the details of the head, making sure that the features are sort of placed in the middle. So in the first frame that we're working on in this section, he's on a 3/4 angle with a head on an upwards angle, and on the last frame in this section, he's on a complete profile angle but aiming sort of up and towards the back. So I need to make sure that I'm getting somewhere in between, which will be facing basically on this angle and just off of a 3/4 angle. Now if I drag that breakdown frame forward and I play through the entire motion, I can see it all in context, and I'm very happy with how that looks. I think that very clearly communicates some extremity in motion. Our character looks bouncy and rubbery, and it's got a fun, cute sort of feel to it, which is really cool. Our next breakdown is from when he's laying down on the ground with his eyes closed to when he's sitting up and a bit dazed. So we need to create our breakdown frame between these two, and once again with a blank frame and our onion skin on, I need to put a head in between them. But I also need to make sure I'm positioning things right. So it's going to have a very high upwards angle, and I want the head to lag behind the body. I want it to look like he's dragging his body up. So I'm going to have it lingering closer towards the first keyframe in this section of animation, and I want to draw the body angled with a very strong arch in the back to show that it's really being stretched and pulled this way with his head sort of hanging by the neck. Speaking of which, I'm going to raise and rotate the body a bit and make it look like the neck is a bit higher than I had it previously. And I'm going to also do the same with his hands. I'm going to have them drag behind so he's lifting himself up by his core rather than using his hands to sit up. And this will really show a bit of a floppy, rubbery aspect to the character, which will be fun to accentuate in the animation. So now I'm just going to make sure to draw the keyframes between the two positions of the knee. We're essentially just having him put his foot down, and that's quite easy to show when we just draw between those two frames to make sure it looks like his foot is flopping down. For the back leg, it's sliding across like this, but what I can do is raise the leg so that it's not sliding on the breakdown frame, and then we have him sort of using it to balance his body and lurch it forwards in a way that he can pull his body up without using his hands. And that's something that we can use as a bit of a trick to move the body around without using his hands and his body, and without looking like he's magically just sliding up. We can use the other limbs without having them just move straight across. And that is, in the end, one of the most important things to remember about creating your breakdown frames. You're not just making a frame between point A and point B. Where you put it and what you do with the breakdown frame completely affects this journey. So if you have an extreme sort of animation smear that stretches up really quickly, you'll find that the motion follows that style and has a different feel to it. And the way you position everything completely affects it as well. So for example, in this scenario, just for demonstration, if I delete all this and have the body sort of hunched forwards and the limbs up in the air, we get a much more different sort of feel, because it's like he's reaching forward before he sits up. Now I'm going to undo all that because I preferred what I drew before, but I'm trying to simply demonstrate that we can use the breakdown to really determine what the motion is doing and how it's going to flow. So now I'm going to draw the mid frame of the face. His eyes are starting to open and his top eyelid is down, his lower eyelid is up, and we're going to draw his mouth starting to open up a bit. And when he's sitting, I actually want him to have his mouth open a bit, which I didn't draw in the key frame, but I'm thinking looks a bit better. So while he's sitting up, his mouth is starting to open. I'm going to draw his ear, and this time the hair is going to be sort of dragging backwards. And then I draw in his hairline, and all of a sudden we have a monkey face, sort of, a very stretched one. And now he's sitting up. I feel like the back of the monkey's head needs to be shorter, and I feel like it also needs to be leaning back a bit more. So now I have a breakdown between these frames, and I can drag this back just a little bit. I don't want to drag it into the middle of this section because it's immediately before he sits up, but you can see already that it essentially sets the tone for how he sits up in a very floppy, lazy sort of way. Now for this section, when he shakes his head and then looks forward, I don't really need to add breakdowns, do I? I could essentially just leave it like this, but I'm going to. And I'm going to for the purpose of adding some anticipation. Not so much before he shakes his head, but here when he opens his eyes and is looking determinedly, there's no real build up to that. There's nothing to accentuate this and make it really stand out. So what I'm going to do is drag this back and add a keyframe before it, and I'm going to, with my onion skin on, paste my previously drawn head, and I'm going to pull it back like this. So that means that before he opens his eyes, he's going to pull his head back before he throws it forward. This is what anticipation is. It's a wind up to the motion happening. And I'm going to really accentuate this wind up by pulling the head back, having the torso with an heavily arching back in that direction, and the head is going to be leaning back, ready to glare in a direction. It's almost like the wind up before a punch when an arm goes all the way back before it comes forward with a lot of might. So I'm going to accentuate this even more by having the eyes squinted aggressively. They're still going to be closed, but they're going to be really, really tightly closed so that we just see a lot of energy building up and tightening in the face. And I'm going to do the same with the mouth, with it very wide and tight. Everything very much sort of winding up, ready to show he means business. And then drawing in the hairline of the face. And now I'm going to draw in the limbs. Now the legs I'm going to keep exactly the same. They'll just sort of stay in their position so that we have a bit of a stable foundation in his body. But what I'm actually going to do with the arms, instead of keeping them exactly in the same position, that would be a bit boring. I'm actually going to raise them up like this and have him lift his arms up and then slam them back down again. And that's going to really show even more exaggeration on this determined, bossy sort of face he's going to be throwing on himself. And there's one thing also I want to change, and that is between this keyframe, our first one, and our ending one, the tail is exactly the same. And I feel like it should be completely different, as if the tail too has woken up and become alert. So I'm going to change the end keyframe to be sort of curled back like this, almost like a scorpion tail ready to attack, and also pointing in the direction that he's facing with aggression. And you can see that the first one is sort of relaxed, and then we end like that. We can then add to our breakdown with our onion skin selected a bit more accentuation on that curve to show the transition, and then we end up on our second keyframe. If I went immediately from this keyframe to the next keyframe, it would be static and a bit boring. Whereas now that I have this breakdown, which I can further accentuate by dragging back and skewing like this, I have much more of a wind up. I have someone who throws himself back before he goes forward, which means later when I tweak the animation, I can have him thrown forwards with some follow through after the anticipation and hit. So it looks a little more like that. So there's a lot more impact in a motion like this. In fact, I'm going to leave this extra keyframe I tentatively added just to show that, that motion in action, and I'm going to throw his hair back like this. So with this motion, we now have two breakdown poses, and one of them is almost identical to the ending keyframe, but it's just forward with some residual motion. And this is a bit more of a follow through frame, while this one is a bit more of an anticipation and wind up. So now playing through where he shakes his head and looks forward, we have a lot more impact in that motion itself, and it's really much more satisfying than if he were to just shake his head and immediately look in that direction. Now we only have two more breakdown frames to do, and they are between the monkey sitting down and the monkey throwing himself back again in anticipation, and then finally between this one and the standing pose, the ending pose. Now the first one is going to be easier to do, so I will create a blank keyframe between them. I'm going to paste my reusable head between them as well, and I'm going to show a very large arc of motion. At the moment there's only a short distance between the first and second keyframe of this motion. So I'm actually going to widen that distance in my arc to show that he moves a lot more before he's fully wound up and ready to pounce. So I'm going to have his legs quite high like this, and his tail is going through under his body from that scorpion position. So it's going to drag through like that, and his arms are being thrown to the ground. Now I feel like that motion is accentuated quite a bit. And now I can draw the features of the face, and I can exaggerate this by showing a much wider area for the teeth as his mouth opens up, and by having the eyes stretch out as he goes backwards. Now that is a breakdown frame I'm pretty happy with to show that motion jumping back. I could actually, in reality, stretch that out even more, pull him a lot higher to add some extremity. And on the last keyframe, I can actually tweak it and throw him back more as well. And then finally, we're up to our last breakdown between these two frames. And this is where we can really show off this arc of motion in as much extremity as we want. And this is where, in this breakdown, he's kicking up from this position to a standing, and we could immediately just sort of follow directly forwards. But really, I want to show a large arc, and I want to have a lot of stretching because it's a very intentional push forward, and he's aggressively doing so. And I have a chance now to do that with a lot of emphasis. So I'm going to really stretch the feet forward as he goes to land. I'm going to have his feet pulled back because they're really stretching and pushing forward by the heels. I'm going to have this motion pulling back all the way around here. I can rotate that so we get more of the body in. In fact, I should bring it forward more. And of course, I'm going to add a bit of a smear to the head, really stretch it out and show the teeth being stretched, show the hair being pulled back, the monkey's outline of their hair, the nose. So you don't see much of the head in this section. I'm really also going to skew it and change it to be a bit more vertical and stretched out like this. I'm just sort of tweaking my sketch as I go along. I really want to throw this out to be as emphasized as possible. And you can see in the entire body, the motion is basically the entire line of the body because we have the entire arc of motion here. And that's what the breakdown is communicating. I'm just repositioning it because I want it to him to very quickly go forward, so much so that I'm going to stretch the feet all the way down like this, just to really make this as extreme as I possibly can. And to add more impact, I'm going to do the same thing for this last frame that I did for when he leaned back and had that extra impact throwing himself forward. I'm going to add a duplicate keyframe and I'm going to squash and push him forward, and I'm going to pull his hair back to show that he's just flown in from the side, and I'm going to stretch his arms back. So I'm tweaking my final keyframe duplicate to add some impact to our landing position. I'm going to also remove the tail and figure out where it's going to go in here because I hadn't done that yet. So using my onion skin to see the previous frame, I would estimate that the tail would be thrown back and look something like this. And then here, his tail would sort of arc up and continue to follow that motion a bit until he eventually lands. And I don't want it to end there. I want it to end a bit more curled up so the tail has followed through on that bounce. So now you can see we have a very long arc of motion in our breakdown, our first breakdown. We have some follow through on our second breakdown before the final keyframe, where we have the hair stretched out, the arms stretched out before they land, and some secondary motion in the hair, the arm, and the tail. And then he lands on his final keyframe. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how I go about the breakdown. So I've done the breakdowns for the entire animation segment. We can see that the motion is emphasized so much more by using the extremity in these breakdowns. And it's really quite a satisfying thing to see put together. You can see from the beginning to the end, the motion and the exaggeration throughout are much more emphasized. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to start doing some solid drawing, which is going to be the first step in making this all come to more of a refined place.